When I was about 8 years old, my mom married my stepdad. After their wedding, she and I moved into his house, which was situated on a sprawling 20-acre property. It was just the three of us, my mom, my stepdad, and me. At the time, we also had 2 large dogs. We ended up living in that house for 14 years, and during that time, I witnessed plenty of odd and unexplainable events. However, there's one memory that stands out more than any other, one I'll never forget. I think I was around 10 years old when it happened, though I can't recall my exact age. What I do remember is the gift I received that year, which helps narrow it down. By that age, I could go to the bathroom by myself at night, though my mom would often check on me just to be sure. It was Christmas Eve, and the house was festively decorated with garlands and colorful lights. The atmosphere was quieter than usual, which made every creak and groan of the old house stand out. That's when the story begins. In our home, the Christmas tree was only lit up at night on Christmas Eve. From the front door, you could see directly into the living room, where the tree stood glowing. Adjacent to the living room was what we called the hall, though it was more of a small square with doors on 3 sides. The bathroom was on the far side of the hall, with a closet next to it on the left. My bedroom door was to the right, and next to that was a blank section of wall about the size of a door, followed by my parents' bedroom door. The kitchen, located off the left side of the living room, shared a wall with the bathroom and the closet. Lastly, we had a basement, which was unfinished and a little creepy. Wooden stairs led down to it from near the kitchen and the back porch, but I always avoided going there alone. On that Christmas Eve, I woke up in the middle of the night needing to use the bathroom. As I left my room and turned toward the hallway, I couldn't resist sneaking a glance at the Christmas tree and the gifts beneath it. I thought I spotted a monster truck among the presents. Back then, I loved monster trucks, especially remote-controlled ones, but I didn't linger because I really had to go. After finishing in the bathroom, I turned back toward the living room, tempted to take another peek at the gifts. Growing up, we rarely closed doors unless we had guests, so from where I stood, I had a clear view of the front door and the soft glow of the Christmas tree lights. I flushed the toilet, then looked back through the doorway leading from the hall into the living room. That's when I saw him. A shadowy figure of a boy stood in the doorway, about my height, his back turned to me. He was holding the doorframe with his left hand while leaning into the living room on tiptoes, as if trying to get a better look at the presents. In his right hand, he held a red lollipop. The light from the Christmas tree outlined him, making his whole body appear dark and shadowy. I stepped closer, standing just inside the bathroom doorway. If I had stretched out my arm, I could have touched him. I was about to ask him who he was and what he was doing there when he slowly rocked back onto his heels and began to turn toward me. The moment he started to turn, I was overwhelmed with an intense feeling of dread. My stomach twisted, and my heart raced. As his face came into view, I saw he was smiling, a wide, unsettling smile, as he stared straight ahead. Just as he was about to fully turn to face me, my mom came out of her room and asked if I was okay. In the split second that I glanced at her and then back toward the boy, he was gone. I pointed toward the living room, trying to explain, but my mom assumed I'd just been sneaking a look at the presents. She guided me back to bed and tucked me in. I fell asleep quickly and didn't think much about it the next morning. I was too excited about my gift, a remote-controlled monster truck. It wasn't until years later that I remembered the incident and told my mom about it. To my surprise, she wasn't shocked. She simply nodded and said that a lot of strange things had happened in that house over the years. Something unsettling happened earlier today, about 10 hours ago, and the more I think about it, the creepier it seems. My older sister, I'm a guy, by the way, wanted to finish up her Christmas shopping, so she put together a list of stores to visit. One of the stops was our local mall in Northern Virginia. I decided to tag along for two reasons. First, because she's pretty petite, and while she gets compliments on her looks, I'm protective of her. Second, she needed help choosing a gift for me, so I was supposed to point out things I liked. We had already been to a few stores, like Hot Topic and American Eagle, but we were running out of options. I'll admit I hadn't been very helpful in suggesting gift ideas. As we wandered through the mall, we decided to check out Spencer's. They often have cool t-shirts and nostalgic items, and I remembered seeing throwbacks to old Nickelodeon shows there before, which sounded fun to browse. We ended up at the back of the store, sifting through t-shirts, but I wasn't finding anything that stood out or was in my size. While we were there, a man walked over and started looking at the same rack of shirts. He seemed to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with short dark hair, a long goatee, an average build, and about 5 feet 8 inches tall. At first, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't unusual for people to browse in the same section, and he was just holding a small coffee cup, so everything seemed normal. Then, he made a casual comment to me, "They've got a lot of stuff in this store. If you've been to Spencer's, you know they sell some adult items in the back, but those were on the other side of the store." I just nodded and kept looking at shirts, not thinking much of it at the time. That's when things started to feel off. I noticed he wasn't really focused on the merchandise anymore. Instead, he kept glancing at me and my sister in a way that made me uneasy. We decided to move to a different rack, walking around to check out clearance items, but he followed us, staying close behind. My sister was clearly uncomfortable, and I started to feel the same way, even though I'm 5 feet 10 inches and about 215 pounds. Maybe it's because I have family in law enforcement, but my gut told me something wasn't right. My sister gave me a look and asked quietly, "Are you ready to leave?" I nodded and gestured toward the front of the store, where there were employees and other customers. As we began walking away, I heard a voice behind me say, "Hey, man." I didn't want to engage, so I ignored him and kept walking. He called out again, more insistent this time, "Hey, man." When I turned slightly, I saw him extending his hand as if he wanted to shake mine. I thought this was odd since we'd had almost no interaction. I just said, "What?" because I didn't see any reason to shake his hand. He replied, "Well, it was nice to meet you anyway." That might not sound creepy on its own, but considering we hadn't exchanged more than a sentence earlier, it felt weird. I responded with, "Nah, I'm good, man," and kept walking. He didn't like that and snapped, "Yeah, well, screw you too, man." I didn't bother reacting and just kept moving, but I think he wanted to provoke me because he yelled a few more things. Meanwhile, my sister, who had been walking ahead, didn't realize what was happening until she heard the shouting. She turned around, looking confused, and asked, "What's going on?" I stayed calm and told her, "Just keep walking." I didn't want to escalate the situation or cause a scene, especially with someone who was clearly trying to get a rise out of me. My main focus was on keeping her safe and getting out of the store. In the back of my mind, I was prepared to act if he followed us, but thankfully, he stayed put and didn't try anything further. We left the store quickly and headed to another shop in the mall to collect ourselves. My adrenaline was still running high, and for the next several minutes, I kept looking over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't following us. Even as we got into the car and drove away, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling of how much worse the situation could have been. This whole experience was a stark reminder to trust your instincts, stay aware of your surroundings, and never hesitate to prioritize your safety. About 4 years ago, when I was 8 months pregnant, I had an experience that still unsettles me to this day. My belly was unmistakably big since I was nearing the end of my pregnancy. I went to the local mall one evening to do some Christmas shopping. By the time I finished, it was around 9 p.m. As I left the mall and walked toward my truck, I had to cross a road that loops around the building to reach the parking lot on the other side. While stepping out, I noticed a man standing in the middle of the road. He made direct eye contact with me, and I quickly looked away, trying to ignore him. At that moment, two other men passed him, heading into the mall, but he didn't acknowledge them. His focus remained fixed on me. As I walked, I noticed the man starting to approach me. "Excuse me, can you help me?" he called out. Being from the South, I was raised to be polite, so I felt it would be rude to completely ignore him. I asked cautiously, "What do you need?" He glanced around before saying, "Can you help me start my car? I think my battery is low." Though I aim to be courteous, I'm not naive. It struck me as strange that he'd ask a heavily pregnant woman for assistance when there were two capable men who had just passed him moments ago. The situation didn't feel right, and I knew I needed to get out of there. I said, "Sorry, I can't help," and continued walking, this time picking up my pace. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see he was still following me. I gripped my keys tightly in my hand, ready to get into my truck as quickly as possible. He called out again, more insistent this time, "You're really not going to help me? I just need a jump." Without slowing down, I responded firmly, "Nope, sorry." When I finally reached my truck, I unlocked it and climbed inside as fast as I could. By this point, he was almost running toward me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to get the key into the ignition. Before I could start the engine, he reached my truck, began pounding on the window, and grabbed the door handle, trying to open it. He yelled, "Just open the door." At that moment, I panicked but knew I had to act. I'd taken self-defense classes in the past and felt I needed to do whatever it took to protect myself and my baby. Rolling the window down just enough to be heard, I said firmly, "I'm warning you, stop following me." For a moment, it felt like time stood still. I wasn't sure what he'd do next, but I was ready to defend myself if he tried to escalate things further. Thankfully, he froze, then silently turned around and walked away without another word. Even though the immediate danger had passed, I couldn't drive off right away. I sat in my truck, trembling and overwhelmed. My mind raced with thoughts of how close I had come to being in serious danger. The experience was terrifying, not just for what could have happened but for how quickly I had to act to protect both myself and my unborn child. It's an experience I never want to repeat, but I'm thankful I trusted my instincts that night. When I was around 8 or 9 years old, something happened on Christmas Eve that I still can't forget. Like most kids my age, I believed in Santa Claus and was filled with a mix of excitement and nerves, imagining him sneaking into the house to leave gifts under the tree. I remember lying in bed, doing my best to fall asleep despite my anticipation. Eventually, I managed to drift off. At some point during the night, I woke up to the faint sound of footsteps in my room. My first thought was that it must be Santa Claus. A wave of nervous excitement washed over me, but I was also scared to look. I didn't want to spoil the magic or scare him away. Slowly, I peeked out, opening one eye just a tiny bit, and saw a dark figure standing next to my bed, staring down at me. The figure was tall, probably around 6 feet, and its entire body seemed to be made of shadows. It looked darker than the already dim room, almost as though it absorbed the light around it. I couldn't make out any facial features, no eyes, nose, or mouth, but its silhouette was unmistakably human. I could clearly see the shape of its head, arms, body, and legs. Because it was Christmas Eve, my first thought was that this shadowy figure had to be Santa Claus. I felt completely frozen in my bed, too frightened to move or make a sound. The figure began to move, taking slow, deliberate steps closer to me. It leaned in slightly but stayed a few feet away, looming over me. It didn't make a sound, but I had the overwhelming sensation that it was watching me. You know that eerie feeling when you just know someone's staring at you? That's exactly what it felt like. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away. After what felt like an eternity, I cautiously opened them again, and the figure was gone. Strangely, I hadn't heard it leave. The house we lived in was very old, with creaky doors and loud, groaning floorboards, yet there had been no sound of it exiting the room. Although I had heard the initial footsteps, I never heard the door open or close. I never saw that figure again, though the house wasn't free of eerie experiences. The next morning, I asked my mom if she'd heard Santa coming into my room during the night. She looked puzzled for a moment, then smiled and humored me, likely assuming I'd made the whole thing up. But I know it wasn't a dream or my imagination. It felt far too vivid to dismiss. Over the years, I've learned that spirits or supernatural entities are sometimes drawn to places filled with energy, emotions, or excitement, and Christmas is overflowing with all of that. I can't pinpoint exactly how old I was, but I know I was still in kindergarten. My dad would often pick me up and take me to a park on the way home, which was one of my favorite parts of the day. He was an amazing dad who went out of his way to make things special. He used to make treasure maps just for me, and before we'd even get to the park, he'd go ahead and hide small treasures, like shiny coins or little toys, for me to find. It was magical, and I'll never forget how much effort he put into creating those moments. One day, while we were walking in the park, we came across a sewer grate with steam rising from it, like it was some kind of furnace. My dad, always full of stories, pointed at it and said, "Look, maybe this is where Santa makes toys for all the good kids." I laughed because, by then, I already knew Santa wasn't real. Still, I got curious and decided to peek through the small holes in the sewer cover. The steam was thick, but through the mist, I saw something strange. There was a man sitting at a table, wearing a hat shaped like a triangle, something I'd never seen before. It was such an odd sight, and it gave me a weird feeling. I couldn't make out what he was doing exactly, but it seemed like he was writing something. The whole thing happened so fast. I froze for a moment, my mind racing. I wondered if my dad's story was true and I was actually seeing an elf, or if this was just another elaborate setup, like the treasures he hid for me to find. I didn't say anything to my dad, and he didn't mention it either. When we got home, I was so excited that I told my grandma I'd seen a Christmas elf in the park. She smiled but clearly didn't believe me. My dad just laughed without confirming or denying anything. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the man with the triangle-shaped hat. I kept picturing him and wondering if he really could have been an elf. Eventually, I convinced myself that my dad must have planned it. Maybe he had asked someone to dress up and sit there, just like he used to hide treasures for me. But years later, when I brought it up and asked my dad about it, he seemed genuinely confused. He told me he'd never done anything like that and wanted to know more about what I had seen. When I described it to him, he said it was probably just my imagination since I was so young at the time. But I know what I saw, and it still feels vivid even now. I even went back to that park years later to check out the area, but it had changed completely. The walking path was gone, the sewer grate wasn't there anymore, and the space was just plain grass. What's even stranger is that, over time, I started noticing similarities between the man I saw and myself. I only caught a glimpse of him from behind, but the texture and color of his hair seemed eerily similar to mine, something I only realized years later when I saw photos of myself as an adult. It's a weird, almost unsettling thought, like I was looking at an older version of myself. I can't say for sure what happened that day, maybe it's just my mind trying to make sense of a childhood memory, but it's an experience that has stuck with me ever since.